Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest of America, off the shores of Oregon and Washington and British Columbia, there lies a single 700-mile-long crack in the earth. And for over 300 years now, it has been almost perfectly silent. No great earthquakes, no warning tremors, nothing at all. And for a very long time, that deep silence was taken as a comforting sign. A sign that this particular place was simply safe. But scientists have now come to understand that the silence was, in fact, something very much more ominous. Because this great fault is not dead at all. It is locked, jammed tight, and slowly and relentlessly building up strain, rather like a powerful spring being wound tighter, and tighter and tighter still. And when it finally does let go, it will unleash one of the very largest earthquakes that this entire continent has ever seen, and it will send a towering wall of water racing directly toward one of the most heavily populated coastlines in all of North America. It is called the Cascadia Subduction Zone. And this is the story of the disaster that is, one day, most certainly coming. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. So, first of all, what exactly is the Cascadia Subduction Zone? Well, to really understand it, you first need to know that the entire surface of our planet is actually broken up into a whole set of enormous and very slowly moving slabs of solid rock, slabs that we call tectonic plates. And off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, two of these vast plates are right now colliding with one another. There is the huge continental plate, the one that the whole of North America sits upon, and then there is a smaller oceanic plate called the Juan de Fuca plate lying just off the coast out in the Pacific. And right here, along this coast, the heavier oceanic plate is being slowly forced down and under the lighter continental one, steadily diving down beneath it, deep, deep into the earth. This entire process is what scientists call subduction, and it just so happens to be the single most powerful earthquake-making machine in all of nature. In fact, every single one of the very largest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on Earth has happened at a subduction zone, exactly like this one. And here is precisely why they are so terribly dangerous. Because as that oceanic plate tries to dive down beneath the continent, the two plates do not simply slide smoothly and gently past one another. Instead, they get stuck. They lock together along an absolutely vast surface, and then they stay locked, sometimes for many centuries at a stretch. But the plates themselves, of course, never actually stop moving. And so, while the fault itself stays jammed tightly shut, the immense pressure just keeps right on building and building and building. The very edge of the continent actually gets squeezed and bent and slowly bulges upward, quietly storing up all of that titanic energy, just like a compressed spring. And then, one day, the friction that has been holding the whole fault together is finally, and suddenly, overcome, the lock breaks. And in a matter of just seconds, that entire bent and strained edge of the continent violently snaps back into place, releasing centuries worth of stored up energy all at once in a single colossal earthquake. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, before today, had you ever even heard of the Cascadia Fault? Let me know down in the comments and where you're watching from. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. So how then do we actually know that Cascadia is truly capable of doing this? Well, we know because it has in fact happened before, and the story of exactly how scientists managed to figure that out is genuinely one of the greatest detective stories in all of modern science. Because for a very long time, almost nobody believed that the Pacific Northwest had any serious earthquake problem at all. Unlike California, with its famous and its frequently rumbling San Andreas Fault, Cascadia was simply quiet. There were no written records of any great earthquakes ever striking there, and so, quite naturally, it was widely assumed to be perfectly safe. But then, back in the 1980s, a small handful of geologists began to notice some genuinely very strange things scattered along the coastline. Because there, in the quiet tidal marshes and the coastal estuaries, they kept finding what have come to be known as ghost forests, eerie, silent stands of long-dead, gray, weathered trees, still standing upright, but very clearly killed, long ago, by salt water. Now, here was the puzzle. These particular kinds of trees only ever grow on dry land, never in salt water. So how on earth had an entire forest of them managed to drown? And the scientists slowly realized that the answer was genuinely chilling. Because at some point in the past, the very land that these trees were standing on must have suddenly and violently dropped by several whole feet, all at once, instantly plunging the living forest down into the reach of the salty tides and killing every last tree with the salt. And the only thing in all of nature powerful enough to drop an entire coastline by several feet in a single instant is an absolutely enormous earthquake. And then, by very carefully studying the growth rings inside those dead trees, and comparing them against the rings of living trees nearby, the scientists were able to pin down almost exactly when it was that those ghost trees had died. It was in the winter of 1699 into 1700. And all around them, they found yet more evidence telling the very same story. Buried layers of old marsh soil and thick sheets of sand that had clearly been dumped far inland by some great wave. Cascadia, it was now clear, had produced a truly massive earthquake right around the year 1700. But they still could not quite pin down the exact date of it, nor could they yet say for certain just how big it had really been. And then came the final, and the truly astonishing, clue of them all, and, remarkably, it arrived from clear, across the entire Pacific Ocean, all the way from Japan. Because buried within centuries-old Japanese written records, historians discovered a detailed account of a mysterious tsunami, one that had come crashing into the coast of Japan late on the night of the 27th of January in the year 1700. It had flooded villages, and it had damaged homes up and down the coast. But here was the genuinely strange and baffling part of it. Not a single person anywhere in Japan had actually felt any earthquake at all before it hit. It was what scientists would later come to call an orphan tsunami, a great tsunami with no local parent earthquake anywhere to be found. And so, for centuries, the true origin of that wave remained a complete and total mystery. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely fascinating, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. But then, when scientists finally put every last piece of it all together, the whole puzzle suddenly fit perfectly. Because a tsunami takes right around 9 or 10 hours to travel all the way across the Pacific Ocean, from North America over to Japan. So, by simply working carefully backwards from the precise time that the wave was recorded striking Japan, the scientists were able to calculate that the earthquake which must have caused it had struck the coast of the Pacific Northwest at around 9 o'clock in the evening on the 26th of January in the year 1700. And, all at once, absolutely everything lined up. The drowned ghost forests and the buried marsh soils and the inland tsunami sands, and now, on top of all of it, a precise and exact date and even a time recorded meticulously thousands upon thousands of miles away in Japan. And there was one final source that confirmed the whole story beyond any real doubt. The rich oral histories of the many Native American peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Histories that had been carefully passed down from generation to generation for centuries. Because these traditions told of a terrible and a specific winter's night, a night when the ground had shaken violently. And for a very long time, and then the ocean itself had risen up in the darkness and swept entire coastal villages completely away. And from the recorded size of that tsunami all the way over in Japan, the scientists were even able to estimate the sheer magnitude of the earthquake that had caused it, somewhere right around a magnitude 9. It had been one of the single largest earthquakes that our entire planet is even capable of producing. And this led directly to the truly sobering realization at the heart of all of this. Because the Great Earthquake of 1700 was very clearly not some strange, one-off event. Because when the scientists then dug even deeper into the geological record, carefully studying ancient layers of undersea landslides and buried soil stretching back many thousands of years into the past, they found the unmistakable fingerprints of dozens upon dozens of these same great Cascadia earthquakes, marching back through time over more than 10,000 years, and on average, one of them appears to strike roughly every few hundred years or so, although the actual gap between them has ranged anywhere from as little as 200 years to as long as 900. The very last one, of course, was back in 1700, which means that it has now been well over 320 years since the last great Cascadia earthquake. The fault right now is locked. The pressure right now is steadily building. And another great Cascadia earthquake is quite simply no longer a matter of if. It is now only ever a matter of when. So what then would actually happen if it were to strike today? Because the Pacific Northwest of the year 1700 was a quiet land of scattered villages. But today, that very same coastline is home to well over 10 million people and to great sprawling modern cities like Seattle and like Portland. When the fault finally does rupture, the very first thing that people will feel is the shaking. And unlike a normal, everyday earthquake, which typically lasts only a few brief seconds, the shaking from a full magnitude 9 Cascadia earthquake would go on and on for as long as 5 or 6 or even 7 entire minutes. Minutes, that is, of violent, relentless, unrelenting ground motion. And the buildings, and the bridges, and the highways of the region, a great many of which were built long before this danger was ever even understood, would all be pushed right to and then far beyond their absolute limits. And in the cities, the soft, wet ground would begin to liquefy, turning what was once solid soil into something much more like quicksand. And the power lines, and the water mains, and the gas lines would all be severed, right across the entire region, in an instant. But for all of the people living out on the coast itself, the shaking would be only the very beginning of it, and in truth, the smallest part of the danger. Because that very same earthquake would, at the exact same moment, instantly shove the entire seafloor violently upward, and in doing so, it would launch a truly colossal tsunami. And here, now, is the single most terrifying part of the whole thing, that tsunami would come racing back to reach the shore in as little as just 15 to 30 minutes. There would be absolutely no time at all to sit and wait for any kind of official warning to arrive. And out on the exposed outer coast, those waves could tower up to as much as 100 feet high. For anyone caught in those low-lying coastal towns, the violent earthquake itself is quite simply the only warning that they are ever going to get, and their one and only chance of survival is to move immediately to high ground, on foot, the very moment that the shaking finally stops. And then, in the terrible aftermath of it all, the sheer scale of the disruption would be almost impossible to imagine. Bridges down, roads buckled and broken, the entire coast completely cut off from the interior. In fact, emergency officials all across the region now openly warn the people living there that they must be fully prepared to survive entirely on their own, without any power or clean water or any outside help arriving at all, for an absolute minimum of 2 full weeks, and, realistically, very likely for a great deal longer than even that. It would, without any doubt, be one of the very worst natural disasters in the entire history of North America. And if you truly want to know what all of this would really actually look like, then you don't even have to imagine it. Because the world has, quite tragically, already shown us, and twice. Because back in 2011, an almost perfectly identical subduction zone, lying just off the coast of Japan, suddenly ruptured in a magnitude 9 earthquake, the Great Tōhoku earthquake. And the whole world then watched, in horror, as a monstrous tsunami swept for miles and miles inland, killing very nearly 16,000 people, and triggering the catastrophic meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And a few years before that, back in 2004, another giant subduction earthquake, this time off the coast of Sumatra, unleashed the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami, which went on to kill some 230,000 people across a dozen different countries in a single day. And these, it must be understood, were not strange or freak events. They were subduction zone earthquakes, the very same exact kind of earthquake that Cascadia will, itself, one day most certainly produce. So, is there any real hope to be found here at all? Is there genuinely anything at all that can actually be done about it? And the answer truly is yes, a very great deal, in fact. Because while we obviously cannot ever stop the earthquake itself from happening, we absolutely can prepare for it, and good preparation saves an enormous number of human lives. Because all along the West Coast, scientists have now actually built a genuine earthquake early warning system, one called ShakeAlert. Now, it cannot predict a quake days, or even hours, in advance. But the very instant that a fault first begins to rupture, it can detect it, and then send out an alert, racing electronically ahead of the shaking itself, faster than the earthquake's own waves are able to travel through the ground. And that can give people precious extra seconds of warning, just enough time perhaps, to drop and take cover, or to automatically stop the trains, or to safely halt a surgery. And communities all over the region are now busy retrofitting their old bridges and their older buildings, and building dedicated tsunami evacuation towers out on the flat, low-lying coast. And, above all, patiently teaching everyone the single most important rule of all, that if you are anywhere near the coast, and the ground begins to shake hard, and for a long time, then you must not wait for anyone at all to tell you what to do. You simply get yourself to high ground. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, and this is by far the most important point of all, absolutely no one can predict when this earthquake is actually going to happen, and I really do want to be very careful indeed with one particular word that tends to get thrown around a great deal in this context, and that word is overdue. Because Cascadia is not in actual fact overdue, at least, not at all in the way that word tends to make it sound, as though some payment were now late, or as though some clock had finally run all the way out. Because earthquakes, quite simply, do not ever work on any kind of fixed regular schedule. The gaps between Cascadia's past great earthquakes have ranged all the way from 200 years, right up to 900 years, which means that being a little over 300 years out from the last one is entirely and completely normal and sits well within the natural range of things. The fault is genuinely not some ticking clock, counting steadily down towards zero. Second, and following directly on from that, the actual, real, near-term odds here are indeed very real, but they are also not nearly as enormous as you might now be fearing. Because scientists currently estimate roughly a 10 to 15% chance of a full magnitude 9 Cascadia earthquake striking within the next 50 years. And something closer to a 1 in 3 chance of a somewhat smaller, though still genuinely major, rupture occurring within that very same window of time. So this is, without any doubt, a genuine and a serious threat, one that the entire region absolutely must take very seriously indeed, but it remains, in the end, a probability and not a prophecy. And it is really very unlikely to happen in any single given year. And third, this is very, very far indeed from being any kind of hopeless situation, because Japan, back in 2011, was struck by an earthquake every bit as large as the one that Cascadia will one day produce, and yet, precisely because of decades of careful preparation and early warning systems and strict building codes, and constantly drilled evacuations, a truly great many people managed to survive who otherwise almost certainly would not have. Preparation, in the end, is quite simply the entire difference between a terrible natural disaster and an utterly unmitigated catastrophe. But the deeper truth of Cascadia is a genuinely profound one, I think, and it is really worth taking a quiet moment to sit with. Because for very nearly all of us, the solid ground beneath our own 2 feet is quite honestly the very definition of everything that is solid and permanent and safe. It is the one single thing in all the world that we simply never think to question. But Cascadia stands as a powerful reminder that this feeling is, in a very real sense, something of an illusion. That the entire surface of our planet is, in truth, alive and slowly moving all the time, and that even the very quietest and the most peaceful seeming places on the whole earth can be quietly storing up, in perfect and total silence, the raw potential for sudden and violent upheaval the people of the Pacific Northwest are, right now. Quite literally living out their lives on the back of a sleeping giant, and the great task that now lies before them is genuinely not to panic about that fact, but simply and wisely to understand it and to respect it, and to be truly ready for the day that it finally and inevitably wakes. So the very next time that you happen to find yourself standing on that beautiful, rugged, windswept coastline of the Pacific Northwest, with all its misty ancient forests, and its crashing gray waves, and its deep and profound and timeless sense of calm, I want you to take just a single moment to remember exactly what it is that lies waiting, just offshore and just beneath. A single 700-mile-long fault, locked and loaded and quietly holding its breath, exactly as it has now done for well over 3 whole centuries. It gave almost no warning at all back in 1700, and it will give very little warning at all the next time, either, and we genuinely cannot ever know for certain whether that next great day is 100 years away from us, or 10 years, or whether it might come tomorrow. But we do know with an absolute and total certainty that it is indeed coming, and perhaps the single most important thing that this whole remarkable story of Cascadia can really teach us is simply this, that the earth itself keeps its own time, on a scale so vast and so patient that it dwarfs an entire human life, and that learning at last. To truly live wisely upon it means learning how to listen carefully, even to a deep silence, and how to quietly prepare in advance for the great things that we cannot see and cannot stop, but that we can, if we are only wise enough, survive.